everyone. So tonight, all of us are really going to share just a number of projects and just a number of ideas and hopefully kind of stepping off points for you. Great stories to read, great kind of ideas, because when I start, I think I'm going to start with a discussion about some grade 12 literature, but for sure the idea of the assignment you can kind of take and adapt to your own class. So I'm going to talk about nonfiction, short stories, and using kind of the fine arts to kind of connect to some of the sustainable development goals and talking about the global world. So next slide, Karen. So we were asked to introduce ourselves. So I am a high school teacher here in Calgary, and I've taught for about 24 years. And I've always been inspired by travel. Whenever I go somewhere, this is a picture on the slide of a New Delhi bookstore. I loved if you went in with a book you wanted, what the bookstore owner would do. So wherever I travel, I am looking for books to let me know about that place. So I just gave you some ideas. In Australia, reading David Malouf. In Egypt, reading Sadawi. In Vietnam, reading Kim Tui. In India, reading Shantaram and White Tiger. And in Cyprus, reading Bitter Lemons. So next slide. Then definitely my second inspiration is my students. And I wanted to share this quote with you. I'm just gonna,
Yeah, you just click this right here.
Right there. Sorry. In this quote, I asked my students what they felt about the text that we were reading in school, or the text that they've read. Perhaps this is a grade 12 student the past 11 years of education. And Michaela was very passionate about just representation and not reading enough books that reflected herself. So her quote was, "Representation always has and always will matter to kids of all ages. Our educators have an enormous amount of control and influence in this area. Yet, time and again, I find that students like me are let down. We are either portrayed as our stereotypes, used as comic relief, or are excluded from classroom discussions altogether. Whether this is through a lack of understanding by the authors we read, representation in the poems we analyze, conversations surrounding our influence on Canadian history, or people who look like us in classrooms, we are extremely misrepresented and underrepresented in school spaces." And I kept this, her last point, for a reason. She added, "I don't know if this is exactly what you were looking for, miss. So please let me know if I can fix it up a bit." One, to remind us just how insightful our students are and how they still second guess themselves when I said, "Michaela, this is exactly what I was looking for. And we really want to find opportunities for students to be brave and to speak up." So my third inspiration, next slide. Definitely would be disrupting what has always been done. And I'm going to just leave this slide for you to look at later. A lot of my inspiration comes from Leanne Bettis-Somosake Simpson. Her most recent book and lecture is called A Short History of the Blockade, and I really recommend that for you. And this quote is part of that book, and she talks about how writers cannot be mere storytellers, but we have to be actively involved in shaping its present and future. So in the next three projects that I'm going to kind of go over with you quickly, I'll just kind of talk about how we can get students and students as writers to be actively involved in shaping the future. Next slide. So the first project is nonfiction. So a lot of times we leave nonfiction out. It always seems to kind of be third or fourth on our list after drama, poetry, and novel. Students are really interested in the number of nonfiction kind of texts that are out there, and it really allows them to pick topics that they're passionate about. So in terms of budget wise, you don't have to buy a whole class set. So in our school, we would buy 3 to 4 copies of one title, and then you could have 20 to 30 titles, and I'll share those with you. Students have freedom to select texts of interest. Last year, we chose 15 to 20 options, and I do have another list of more you could add. And what students would do is they would read the nonfiction text, they would share a project proposal via Google Form, they would form a point of inquiry from the nonfiction text. So based on this text that I read, this is something that I would want to look into further. And they would research and summarize their findings and create a podcast or infographic. So if we go to the next page, so some of the texts that we introduced this year, you can see them here. I'll leave them for you, and if you can always email me questions about them. So Braiding Sweetgrass, looking at Indigenous studies. Shout, we're looking at a sexual assault and a firsthand narrative about that. Two Trees Make a Forest, we're looking at Taiwan and parks and conservation. The Beast, we're looking at the migrant train. And The Beast was one I wanted to point out. There was a controversy a couple years ago about that novel American Dirt and the idea that it was written by an American and whether or not she was appropriating that topic. So it's always something to be aware of, who is the author and who are they writing about. So when the controversy of that book came out, there was a lot of talk about here are other authors that you should look at. And Oscar Martinez was someone who was a journalist following and living in Mexico and following the migrant situation. So a more authentic text. Okay, so you guys can look at these ones later. Next slide. So here are just two examples, and an infographic is quite challenging to show on a Google slide because of the size, so I can share these with you, and I do have them in a Google site that I shared on the first slide. So the student who read The Beast decided to focus on undocumented migrants and the risks they face, and they were tasked with creating an infographic and combining data and information. And the student who read White Fragility, Sarah L., she decided to focus on how racism impacts the health of Black people. And she works in the health industry. So this was something that was really near and dear to her. Next slide. And then I just left this, I just added this today because this was my wish list of new books. So we have about 20 books right now for students to choose. And if I were to add books, here's a list of nonfiction. I think these would work for grades 10 to 12. And they're adding diverse titles, important global issues. We're talking about disability. We're talking about LGBTQ+, etc. So lots. This one, Reaching Mythman, I'm going to pronounce that incorrectly, is about the migrant trail in Greece. So that is for you to take away. Next slide. All right, so project 2. So the next thing we wanted to do was to make sure that students, because we know a lot of times in the prescribed curriculum, students are studying Shakespeare and then they're studying modern drama, which for many years has been in our school board, we have kind of white male playwrights, and then novels, etc. And I really wanted to use the short story genre to highlight a number of diverse and authors that students may not have read before. So in this project, they're doing comparative writing and greater discussion connected to sustainable development goals. So I'm just going to show you the 4 short stories, and then more information on these is provided in the Google site. And all of this was inspired. If you haven't read this book yet, I recommend it. Matthew Salesi's. The book is Craft in the Real World, and the synopsis tells you exactly what we want to hear. The traditional writing workshop was established with white male writers in mind, and what we call craft is informed by their cultural values. And it really asks us to question how the Western narrative has really influenced what we read and how we write, and what we expect when we pick up a book. And so the short stories that I've tasked my students to read this year really sort of challenge them in terms of their layout and their style. And we talk about why, and they'll read it first and they'll say, this really confuses me. And we talk about what's confusing them in terms of perhaps a different plot or a different character, and not really just relying on this person versus person typical Western plot. So next slide. So 4 stories I'd like to highlight for you to read later on is The Great Indian Tea and Snakes by Kritika Pandey. She talks about a young female protagonist in India, and this one is connected to how to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And the quote from the opening line is quite telling. The girl in the black bindi knows that she is not supposed to glance at the boy in the white skull cap, but she does. Okay, next slide. Embassy of Cambodia by Zadie Smith, I also highly recommend. I picked this up because it actually starts, the style is quite nice. It starts in the way it's structured is like a badminton match, and it starts with a win-loss ratio of 0-1, 0-2, and the narrative is organized around that win-loss ratio. And it is using that kind of game of badminton to talk about the game of life and who are the winners and the losers. So it connected to the goal of the SDG goal of reduce inequality within and among countries. Next slide. Please pick up this book. I think this book would work from some of the stories from grade 9 all the way up to grade 12. And we read the story Picking Worms. And in this, we talked about Sustainable Development Goal number 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. In it, the protagonist's mother works very hard but loses her job to a younger white male who is speaking better English than her and is denied kind of that access to decent employment. Next slide. Lastly, we study Calvino's Daughters of the Moon. I'd say this is a more mature grade 12 text. And in this one, society decides to throw out the moon because in a world where every object was thrown away at the slightest breakage or aging, the moon is looking old. And in this one, we talk about sustainable consumption. So next slide. So this is just for you to use. After we read a set of stories, a set of 4, students choose an element or a theme that they want to compare, and they write their comparative essay. So some might choose erasure, some might choose shame, some might choose trauma, or they might choose a specific element. Next slide. And I'm just going to leave, there's 2 student reflections. We'll just look at this one because for time. And then there's another one that you can have. So you can see how the students are really making those connections and coming up with the greater kind of global perspective we want them to. Through their works, The Embassy of Cambodia and Worms, Zadie Smith and Suvankam Tamavangsa respectively discuss how life often plays out similar to a sports game, with each individual being a player. However, when an individual is disadvantaged due to inherent inequality and prejudiced expectations, they are forced to become the underdogs in their own lives, which often prevents them from succeeding in life or winning in this case. Because individuals in these situations may be unable to escape from them, it results in them never truly being free, something that these authors exemplify in their respective pieces of literature. And I love that the student came to this realization, because I think that idea of like systematic racism and systems that really kind of control people is sometimes challenging to understand. And these 2 stories really kind of helped my student kind of see this in real life. So next slide. And that's just Sam's reflection. I'll leave that for you. Next slide. All right, next project. This one can definitely work, I think, from K to 12. What the students did is we worked with the art teacher and we designed graphic tees for social change. And if you're in a school where you don't have access to a sublimation machine, for graphic tees, stickers work too. Students can design stickers and have them printed, but most students nowadays even know how to create stickers and use them with tape. So this is something that I think anybody could do in any school. And we looked as we chose literature as the pathway to empathy and understanding. And in this case, we looked at The Grizzlies, 2 documentaries, The Motorcycle Diaries. We looked at the film, but also parts of the novel. And the novel by a Filipino author, if you haven't read this is fantastic. We looked at the novel Patron Saints of Nothing. So next slide. So first thing we did, so whenever you're sharing a text with a student, we want to identify as a group, what are the issues? So for a sample for you is in The Grizzlies, we talked about multi-generational trauma. We talked about alcoholism. We talked about unifying purpose through sports, traditional ways of knowing, and the food desert that's in the Arctic. We looked at 13th and identified the issues of slavery and mass incarceration. We looked at Motorcycle Diaries and we talked about Indigenous peoples in South America. and the social injustice of persecuted mine workers, usually who are working for a transnational company. And in Patron Saints of Nothing, we looked at corruption, the police state, drug wars, and kind of a dual loyalty to perhaps Canada and the US and to the Philippines for our protagonist. So next slide. So super fun. We asked students what specific action or understanding needs to happen to begin to address these issues. And students then work to put that action on a t-shirt.
Nancy?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that you saw the message in the chat.
I did.
The interpreter. Okay, great. Because
I
saw that the interpreter has her raised her hand. Maybe it was just a quick reminder. Thank you.
I did. Sorry. So really great project. Students loved it. The idea to create a slogan or a statement that compels students who are seeing this t-shirt to action. And then next slide. And then lastly, I'm just going to leave you this slide to use on your own. It was one of my favorite projects that we've worked on. We looked at students, and you can look at all the videos on YouTube. What we did is we combined spoken word with dance, and we created a show that was all about water awareness. So we worked with the NGO KAWST, K-A-W-S-T, and we looked at how can we write persuasive spoken word poetry that compels students to be aware about water issues, and then definitely how can we encourage people to feel and care, and we know that you can do that definitely through dance and song. So these examples, you'll see just how we incorporated that idea of the theme of water through poetry and dance. And if you could do something like this at your school, it's just is really powerful and amazing. So thank you, everyone. Sorry, like Bill, I went over my time.
It was perfect, Nancy. We're not over.
Okay.
Thanks very much.